Good afternoon, everyone. Hey, welcome. We're glad you're here. My name is Wayne Johnson, and I'm one of the three new moderators for our Scripture Ministry Lecture Series. Wanted to make sure to point out the other two. One is Greg Strand, over there, Greg, and then the other is Steve Farish, he's here. And the three of us, Lord willing, will be giving guidance to the Scripture Ministry Lecture Series. This is the first lecture of the year. And there are others coming, which you'll hear about more later on. But I did want to just welcome you in my new role and the new role of my colleagues as well. We are delighted today to be here to talk about a very important topic. Emerson and Smith, in their book that's been widely read, Divided by Faith, has noted sadly that Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week in American culture. And if you are a biblical Christian, a Christian who's concerned with the gospel, a Christian who's concerned about salvation and grace coming to all, and also to those concerned that the church be a model and a witness of what God's reconciliation is all about, then you should be concerned, and we need to be concerned about race and ethnicity and reconciliation. So we're delighted today to have with us Dr. George Yancey. He is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of North Texas. And he is going to speak to us on principles for successful multiracial churches. He has been a sociologist and has done research in this area. He's studied churches and trends in this regard. He's written a number of books, One Body, One Spirit, that you may be familiar with, InterVarsity Press. And is also, with his wife, Sherilyn, is the founder of Reconciliation Consulting, which is a consulting firm that desires to help churches who are seeking to bring multicultural, multiracial ministry into their churches. In addition, he's part of Mosaics. Sorry, not Matrix, that's a movie. Mosaics, thanks. Which is an organization seeking to network churches that are committed to intentional multiracial reconciliation. So we're very happy to have George with us. Before I invite him up, I ask us to bow for a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for your gospel in Jesus Christ. We thank you that your love and your grace has reached out to us while we were your enemies. And you sought to reconcile us to yourself. We pray that you might bless our time here together. May you bless our speaker, work through him. May you bless our discussion, that it might be helpful, Lord, that we might lead in your church. Your church might be a witness of your global love, your global perspective. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you will, would you please welcome Dr. George Yancey.
Good afternoon, and I'm glad you all decided to come out here and hopefully listen to me blather for a little while, and maybe in the between time some knowledge will somehow slip out. When I moved to Fort Worth, my wife and I, we wanted to find a church. And we wanted to find a church that was racially diverse. So we visited around several different churches. Had a hard time finding one that we liked because, there's other important issues, such as the theology of the church and how friendly people are and things of that nature. And we finally found a church we liked in a lot of other ways, but it wasn't diverse. Well, we decided to give it a try. And so we attended a few Sundays, and after a few Sundays, I told her, look, I don't think this church is for me. I know it has a lot of wonderful things, but at this point in my life, I want to be in diversity. And my wife, Sherilyn, had already begun to attend a women's Bible study. So she told the women in the Bible study that, well, this church is going to work out. My husband really wants to find one that's racially diverse. And the reaction of the women in the Bible study was very classical, because their reaction was, well, we are open to people of all races, they just don't come. And I knew from having lived that church was not going to attract people of different races. But that church was a sincere church. I mean, when they said that, they weren't trying to just give a put on. They really were open to people of different races. But they just weren't going to come. And that is really the purpose of this talk and of my book, One Body, One Spirit, is what can the church do to bring people of different races into its ministry? Now, let me tell you a little bit about the state of the research in this topic. I came out with a 1999 article on multiracial churches. That was the first systematic study of anything on multiracial churches there had been. No one had studied anything on this except for a few case studies up until that point. Now, of course, you know about the work of Emerson and Smith, and there's been some stuff since then. But what I'm telling you is that there's not a lot of research out there yet. Think about it this way. Let's think about all the knowledge that's humanly possible on youth ministry. And let's say there's a 0 to 100. 100 is all the knowledge humanly possible on youth ministry, and 0 is nothing, not diddly. Well, what's the state of the field on youth ministry? How well do we know about it? Would you say it's like about a 90 or 95? I mean, how much, honestly, and for a good thing, you've seen some of those youth? We need to minister to them. But there's been a lot done on it. Or if we want to talk about doing missions work, overseas missions work, probably around 90, 95, or maybe a little bit less on elderly ministry. We've got our older folks a little bit more, maybe only 80, 85. I would tell you that probably if you had the same scale, 0 to 100, of all human knowledge on multiracial ministry, probably the person who would score the highest is probably Michael Emerson. He'd probably do a 12. I consider myself a 10. Not just on the looks, of course, but also in that 0 to 100. But what I'm telling you is that if the foremost expert is at a 12, and I'm maybe just a little bit below that, there's still a lot of questions we don't have answered. So what I'm going to present to you is not definitive. It's not, boy, this is time and tested over centuries of time. We're still learning ourselves. And as we learn, we like to lead some of you ones along. So, you're 1 on the 0 to 100. So, we're trying to lead you along a little bit. When I give that example, I do have people come up and say, well, you may be at a 10, but I'm at a 2, so, go on and tell me what you know. So I'll try to do that. So let's see how this is going to work. Okay, good. Yeah, the purpose of this presentation is to offer you practical advice for either starting or maintaining your multiracial ministry. This is going to be a very practically oriented talk. I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing why we should have multiracial ministries, and then I really want to dive into what works. And this is based out of a Lilly study, and I won't bore you with the details unless you want me to do it the question and answer session, where we studied nationwide churches all over the country. And so what I'm going to show you are the principles that tend to work. But first, let's get to why we should have multiracial churches. I'm going to just briefly go through 3 of them. Reaching multiracial communities, racial reconciliation, and racial unity as a witness. Multiracial communities. You may well have heard the stats that by the year 2050, European Americans are going to be a minority or close to a minority of the people in the United States. All over this nation, the percentage of population that's white is declining, which means it's more multiracial. Even without that, there's still certain multiracial communities that even today need to be reached. For example, integrated subcultures such as athletes, such as artists, the homeless. There's a church out in California well known for reaching the entertainment community. The entertainment community is racially diverse. If you're going to reach the entertainment community, you better have a place where they can bring their friends. Okay? And their friends are probably going to be of different races. So if there's an integrated subculture, you need a multiracial group. College students. One of the things I do in order to keep up with my college students is watch MTV. And then I usually want to repent. But I watch MTV, and if you watch MTV, what you're seeing is much more racial diversity exhibited. It's really astounding from when I grew up watching TV. Because on MTV today, people of different races are thrown together, and it's like it's natural, nothing. Well, this is what students today are watching. And they're going to grow up in this way. And what this means is that college students, if you're going to reach them, you're going to do a much better job if your church or your ministry, if it exudes racial openness. And then, missed the button. Interracial families. The last census, interracial marriages were about 5% of all marriages. That's up from about 2% or 3% in the 1990 census. Interracial families are increasing. Biracial individuals, transracial, adopted families are increasing. I tell you, multiracial churches, they attract interracial families like a magnet. I was talking to a pastor friend of mine, head of a multiracial church, and he told me of a guy who called him out of the blue and said, I'm interracially married. Is it all right if I come to your church? And that just floored him, because evidently, by that question, the guy's showing that his experience with the church is that showing up, he was African American, with his white wife, he is not always accepted. And one of the things that got me into saying multiracial churches was the need for interracial families. So if we want to reach the world, there are certain groups, even today, we're going to need multiracial ministries to reach, much more so in the future. As, Chicago's diverse, it's even more diverse. Wisconsin, where I lived 3 years, is even more diverse. And it was very white when I first got there. It was still very white when I left, but it was a little bit less white. There's a few more people moving in. That's the future of our country. Also, racial reconciliation. Why do multiracial churches help racial reconciliation? Now, this could be a topic in and of itself. So understand, I'm sort of skimming it at this point. But I would argue that if we, the Christian church, are going to be part of healing the racial divide, we're going to need more multiracial institutions. Well, one of the reasons why it helps is interracial communication. Is that what happens is when you have these church settings, and I've done the research to demonstrate this, something different happens with an integrated church than with an integrated, say, school. People talk at a deeper level in church than they do in school. In school, what they talk about? What's going to be on the test? That's what they tell me anyways. At church, you talk about the intimate aspects of your spirituality. So we see a lot more of this interracial communication. What my research has shown is that whites who attend multiracial church have more knowledge about racial issues than other whites on average. So we know that that is part of the key. Also, we learn to adjust to the cultures of other people. And that, of course, is very important. If you grow up with just people of your own race, then you can kind of get a cultural arrogance about yourself. And too often, we Christians, we think that our culture is God's culture. It's when other people come and challenge you that you begin to realize there's other ways of doing things that are just as good, that are just different. And so we can learn to adjust to other cultures. I tell you, one adjustment that I've talked to some white pastors of multiracial churches is they learn the importance of titles for African Americans. That when they have other African American pastors, people that they think they can call by their first name, that's not the way it's done in the African American church. They learn to call that person pastor because that's a sign of respect. Now, I'm not saying one is right. I mean, if you want to call your pastor by the first name, that's fine. There's nothing sinful about that at all. Or the other way. But what I'm saying is that you don't understand these cultural differences until you're thrown into the mix. And then it gives us an opportunity to confront our racial fears. And unfortunately, they're still there. I have a few gray hairs now. When I did, I used to hear car doors locking, as they drive by me. 30, 40 miles an hour, and you can actually hear the electric locks go down. And I thought, man, I'm fast, but 40 miles an hour, I don't think I can catch that car. And that told me, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I haven't had these gray hairs too long. I know it's going to get grayer and grayer still, but I haven't had them too long. And what it told me is, there's still a lot of fear out there about it. I actually have heard the car doors locked just walking through the parking lot, believe it or not. And then I hear them unlock as I walk away. So there's a lot of racial fear out there. In multiracial churches, it becomes harder to have fear when you begin to have those close, tight friends in your church. And then I just want to talk about our damaged Christian witness. And you probably heard this saying, Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week. That's by Martin Luther King. He said in the 1960s. Martin Luther King, if he's still alive today, could still say the same thing. In our study of multiracial churches, we define a multiracial church as a church where no one racial group is more than 80% of the population. By that stat, a little bit less than 8% of all churches in the United States are multiracial. Now, that doesn't tell us everything, because Catholic churches are more likely to be multiracial than Protestant churches. About 12% of the Catholic churches are multiracial. Since it's a Protestant university, this should concern you. When we look at just Protestants, we're looking at about 5% of all churches are multiracial. If you want to look at the mainliners, it's about 2.5%. Now, Sunday morning, other than perhaps our families, and even our families are becoming more integrated than our churches are still the most segregated place in the United States. And that says, if schools can integrate, why can't churches? Well, you know why? Because schools are not voluntary. Your kid may want to be voluntary because they go to school. And so people can integrate, but churches are voluntary. So we're voluntarily having only 8% of our churches integrated. Now, I know it's a little bit more complex than that, but we have to realize that. And let's just be honest. If Christians cannot deal with racism, why should non-Christians believe we can deal with other, more deeper spiritual problems? If we are exhibiting the same sort of segregation in society, why should they look at our churches and say, there's something here that I can't find elsewhere? I mean, they can find their own racial group elsewhere. They don't need us for that. So I'm of the belief that, our Christian witness is badly damaged because of what's happened with our church setting. Non-Christians will take their kids to church because their kid has gone wild or their kid is on drugs, because the church has done something about that. I don't think a good non-Christian will take his or her kid to church because the kid has a problem with racism. Look for somewhere else with good reason, unfortunately, at this point. Okay, so a brief synopsis. Some of the reasons why I believe our churches need to become more racially diverse. So, how do churches become multiracial? The research suggests 4 different paths, and real briefly, I'll go through them. Leadership multiracial churches. These are churches that became multiracial because the leadership of the church, the clergy and sometimes laity, they decided that they were going to become multiracial. And they made it such a priority that they changed the church enough so it would become racially diverse. Generally speaking, these were more charismatic type worship churches that did that, and the leader was probably held in a little bit more higher esteem than normal. There's also what we call evangelical multiracial churches. And these are churches that became multiracial because the people in the church decided to reach out to everyone in the neighborhood, and in doing so, they became racially diverse. Well, not even in the neighborhood, sometimes people in the city. So the desire for evangelism created this desire to become multiracial. As you probably would guess, conservative Protestant churches, more evangelicalistic churches, they're more likely to become evangelical multiracial churches. There are demographic multiracial churches, which are churches that became multiracial because their neighborhood changed. As their neighborhood became diverse, they became diverse. We found that Catholic churches and some mainline churches were likely to become multiracial in this way. And then this is the fascinating one, network multiracial churches. These, I think, are the churches of the future. They became multiracial because the social networks of the people in the church became racially diverse. A lot of these churches attract college students, multiracial couples. These churches actually were more likely to grow than other multiracial churches. It wasn't any certain denomination that tended to have networked multiracial churches, so there's no pattern in that way. But I think these churches offer a glimpse of what we could expect in the future. I would encourage churches to look at these the integrated social networks of their own members because of the possibilities of these churches. Okay, real quickly, let me first I'm just going to list the 7 principles, and then I'm going to go into them one at a time. So trying to write notes, you may just not want to try to write all this down because I'm going to go to each of them one at a time. Inclusive worship, diverse leadership, an overarching goal, intentionality, personal skills, location, and adaptability. I found these 7 principles were important, and it wasn't the case that all multiracial churches used all these principles, but they tended to use most of these principles or 1 or 2 of them to a high extent. No multiracial church I found had none of these principles. Okay, first one, inclusive worship. And that's a worship style that includes cultural elements of more than one group. I've been in enough churches that if you blindfolded me and sent me in the church and I just listened to the worship service, and at the end of the service, I will tell you within 5 percentage points the percentage of the population of the majority group in that church. Probably get it right about 90% of the time. Put me in a multiracial church with inclusive worship, that's when I'm going to get it wrong. Because a lot of our culture is captured in our worship. I grew up in an African American church. There's a lot of culture, African American culture in that. There's different types of European American culture. In some of the European American churches, there's probably, there's just different types. And then, if you go to Latina churches and the like, you'll see that there's a culture there. So when you go to church, if the culture feels like a racial group that's not your own, you're probably less likely to want to stay at that church. You may think it's a great place, but you may like the people, but it's not your culture, so you move on. Multiracial churches try to find ways to be more inclusive in their culture. How do they do this? Well, when it comes to music, here's a few ways in which this has been done. One is a totally new worship style. That church I told you about in Los Angeles, what they did was, because they had all these, entertainment people, artsy people, all that sort of stuff. They probably driven me mad, but it was good for them. They wrote their own worship music. They got together. They're very talented, and they did. They had a totally new worship that wasn't linked to any single culture because it was really done from within the church. So it is possible to have a worship style that's distinctive from all other racial cultures, and that by itself becomes inclusive because no culture can say, hey, this is mine. No, it becomes ours. So that's one possibility. If you lack, the number of talented artistic people to do this, you may want to try this. Alternate Sundays. I know of a church that will have black spirituals one Sunday, and then hymns the next Sunday, and then Tejano music the following Sunday. And the pastor says, I enjoy worship 80% of the time. 20% of the time, I hate the worship. And he says, I'm the most powerful person in that church. So if I'm not going to get what I want 100% of the time, no one is. But when the worship is going on and I don't like it, I am praising God because my brother and sister of another culture, they are enjoying it. So I'm learning to give to them and they learn to give to me. And so this is his philosophy on worship. And so they alternate the Sundays. What's most common is blending it all together. This may be distinctive songs. A lot of times there may be a song that's in style of one culture, then the next song is style of a different culture. It may be that I remember this one church where it was like 70% Latino, but the worship leader was African American, and then they sung songs that were from European American culture. So you had these Hispanics singing these white songs led by a brother who's giving a little bit of soul to it. I mean, it was great. I mean, it was really kind of, I can't describe it. You had to be there in order to really understand it. And so, it was just throwing all these cultural elements together. It was really fascinating. So, you can find ways in which you can make your own cultural blend, which becomes inclusive because you're helping everyone to sort of feel like their culture is expressed in the worship. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's the music. And of course, worship is more than music. It is preaching style. Preaching style, of course, is how you deliver the sermon. In African American church, there's the call and the respond. You're not going to attract too many European Americans with that sort of preaching style. But it's also other things. It's what do you preach about? It's what illustrations do you use? When I was in Wisconsin, and, I'm not blaming my pastor in Wisconsin. It was a white church because it was whites. That's all there was in my city when I first got there, it seemed like. And he used spin and Oli jokes. Spin and Oli, I mean, it's not like I had a lot of choices as far as trying to find, some Leroy jokes or anything like that. But, I'd like to think that if the church became more racially diverse, that he would at least work in a few more jokes that weren't just spin and Oli. But what do you preach about? How do you approach topics? It will change as your church diversifies. There's no doubt about it. And what you may have to do is read on other cultures so it can change your preaching style. It's the organization of the service. One interesting fact that we found out was that multiracial churches tended to be longer than the average white service and shorter than the average black service. They're compromising. Most whites don't want to be there 2 hours, and most African Americans at 1 hour, they're just getting warmed up. So, go about an hour and a half, the blacks are, heated enough, and the whites are like ready to go watch football. So, everyone's, not completely happy, but there's a compromise in there. The length of time, in some African American churches, they have the offering and the tithe, and whites often don't understand where that comes from. So you have to find some sort of compromise. How is the service organized? Is it organized towards one culture to exclude other cultures or not? And then there's the interior decor. What color is Jesus on the walls? What colors are the people in the pictures on the walls? Do your restrooms, if you have a Latino population, are the signs in the restrooms in Spanish as well as English? These are some of the questions you have to ask because your worship is the environment that you're in. What about hanging flags of the different nations in your church, in the congregation? I know some congregations that do that. And it gives, not just an international feel, but because we're not just talking about Africans, but African Americans. We're not talking about just, Guatemalans, but Latino Americans. It really brings in more of a multicultural feel to it as well. There are things you can do to make your interior decor more inclusive. These are things that you have to consider. So worship, that's a very important step. Another very important step is diverse leadership. And that is clergy or laity leadership that reflects the racial makeup of the congregation or the desired makeup of the congregation. Okay. Why is diverse leadership important? There's a variety of reasons. First, it lets the numerical minority group know that their concerns will be heard. I remember talking with one pastor who he was in the Los Angeles area, and he was a white guy, a small white guy, and he said when the Rodney King riots came about, he found out from his black leaders who were serving with him in the church that the African Americans did not look at as the Rodney King riots. This was the Rodney King uprisings. Because riots just means a bunch of people just going around being crazy. Uprisings this is a system we're trying to throw off. Very different. Changed his perspective, his understanding of how African Americans looked at the police. Being a small guy, he saw the police as his protectors. And up until that point, he didn't understand that the African Americans saw the police sometimes as an invading force. Now, this is not to say that his perception was wrong and theirs was right. But if he's going to minister to African Americans, he needs to know how they're looking at this situation. It communicates acceptance to the numerical minority group. The numerical minority group doesn't have to be people of color. We were told this one church was a multiracial church. We went to visit it. We looked up there. The leadership was black. And we looked around the church. The church was black except for about 5% of the church. And we quickly realized it was not a multiracial church. If you're not black and you go to that church and you look up there and the leadership's all black, are you sure that you're going to be accepted into leadership? That's the question you have to ask. When people go up to your church and they look up and who's on the podium? Are they represented on the podium? If they're not, then it's going to be a lot less likely people are going to feel comfortable about staying. even if you don't want to be in leadership, it's nice to know that you could be if you're qualified. If you look up there and there's someone like you up there that you could be in leadership, that's important. And allows the head pastor to learn about racial groups other than their own. One church I know of where, because of the leadership, the head pastor was concerned about the Latinos who were not coming to Sunday night service. And he found out from his Latino pastor the reason why they weren't coming is for the Latinos in the area, Sunday night was family time. For them, that was just as spiritual as coming to Sunday night service. Now, that changed that pastor's perception. Instead of, condemning his Latinos for not coming to church, he realized that they were now practicing something in their own way, which was just as important. So you can see multiracial leadership is incredibly important. Real quickly, what diverse leadership is not. It's not the acceptance of theology different from your own. To me, that is madness. Because the fights over theology are going to be much more important than the cultural fights, and you don't want that in your leadership. It's not hiring unqualified people. There's this perception, I just got to get someone of a different race in there. No, you got to get someone qualified. Now, be careful what you call qualifications. That's all I'm saying. Don't make sure they're not cultural. Make sure they're scriptural. If they're scriptural and the person's not qualified, then help train that person to become qualified. Work with that person. But if your qualifications are cultural, then maybe that cultural difference is what you need on your leadership board. And it's not a call for quotas. We're not talking about some sort of strict quota system. We're talking about really intentionally going out and finding these leaders. I think that if a church, if it's ready to try to make the transition, and the people in the congregation are ready, the worship style and the leadership are two of the most important initial steps you want to consider, because they're going to become some of the hardest steps. Those are the steps where people are going to be most resistant. Change the worship style, whoa, you know the wars that can happen with that. And then hiring leaders who are different, who may come culturally differently. But those are two vital principles. Okay, another important principle is an overarching goal. And this is a non-racial goal, which is easier to meet if the congregation becomes multiracial. Very few congregations can become multiracial by making that the primary goal. Why? Because we have a certain amount of racial fatigue in our society. People are tired of talking about racial issues. Whites are tired about hearing about it, and people of color are tired about talking about it, and nothing gets done. There's the racial fatigue. So if you get excited about making that your goal, becoming multiracial, what's going to happen is, after about 6 months, people are going to get tired of it. And there's going to be no motivation to have a follow-through. What I found is that there usually was a more important goal that the church had. And then being multiracial helped the church to meet that more important goal. And then your motivation is not because of, we want to be multiracial, it's because it's a more important goal. One thing you run into, if being multiracial is your primary goal, is the charge of political correctness. So, you say, well, no, being multiracial will help us to meet this goal. And then that helps to deal with that charge. Well, what are some potential overarching goals? Well, the most obvious one is evangelism. As evangelicals, if we want to reach our world, and our world is changing, then we're going to have to engage in evangelism of people of different race. There's this one church that I can't get out of my mind because most of the churches we studied were either mainline, Catholic, or evangelical. This one was what we call fundamentalists. The pastor, in fact, I didn't actually go to this, but Michael Emerson went to the pastor when he did his Wednesday night series. He's doing a Wednesday night series, a 10-part Wednesday night series on why we should use the King James Version of the Bible. I kid you not. So I was thinking, how can a church like this become multiracial? Well, what they did was they decided that they were going to reach the whole city for Christ. And so they purchased these big old ugly yellow buses and sent them to all the neighborhoods in the city. Well, pretty soon in the white neighborhoods, they weren't getting much of a response. But in the black neighborhoods, they started picking up kids. And so they said, well, they had no intention of becoming multiracial, by the way. They weren't trying. No, they really weren't trying. But to their credit, their desire to reach people of Christ is, well, if this is who God's bringing, this is who we'll minister to. And by the time we got there, they had like 30 buses. And they had bought these buses. They had to do the upkeep of these buses. I rode on one of the buses, and they had like 4 or 5 people had to ride each and every bus because these kids were, I was like, give me a gun, please, So they were committed, fully committed to their ministry, and their ministry created racial diversity. And as most of those kids, when they grew up, they did not continue going to church, but some did. And over time, the church became racially diverse. Their goal was evangelism. To achieve that goal, they had to eventually learn how to become multiracial. A couple of other ones, community service. A lot of times Catholic churches serve the community, become racially diverse because the community is racially diverse. And then, although I don't see this very often, I think that theoretically there could be social gospel, political activism. You'll be much more powerful with a multiracial voice than a voice of a single race. But the goal, remember, would be greater than becoming multiracial. That is the key to this overarching goal. Intentionality. And that's the intentional efforts on the part of leaders and members of that church to create or maintain an integrated congregation. You have to intentionally go at it. Now, this seems like, okay, you just said, don't make it your primary goal. How can we be intentional? Once you understand that to meet that primary goal, you have to be more racially diverse, then you can be racially diverse then you can become intentional in being racially diverse. So they actually work together. I actually did a follow-up, and I found that the churches that relied on these overarching goals were more likely to be intentional. So they actually do work together. Why is intentionality important? Intentionality communicates a willingness to go out of our way to become multiracial. A pastor, a white pastor who was trying to make his church more racially diverse, recognized that the worship style was not working, and so he adopted a more charismatic, and what he calls a more Pentecostal worship style. And in doing so, in changing his worship style, he communicated that, I'm not completely comfortable with this, but this is going to reach people of different races and reach out into my community. Therefore, I'm going to be doing this. You communicate your openness in this way. It helps us to think about what's necessary for a multiracial environment. One of the things some churches are doing is their worship. You know how we do the little PowerPoint? They're also now starting to put some of the words in Spanish now. And some of them are starting to sing some of the verses in Spanish. After you sing a couple times in English so that us non-Spanish speakers can know what the rhythm is like, then, you have some lead in Spanish. Because what that's doing, even if you don't have a lot of Latinos and Latinas, what that's doing is it's creating a more multiracial environment. And that's being intentional about it. So we have to think about, how can we create a more multiracial environment? Helps us to overcome the norms of subtle segregation in our society. We have a segregated society. You all may not realize that being in Chicago, how it's so integrated and all. But the rest of the society is quite segregated as far as, neighborhoods. We actually have some neighborhoods. I know you all probably don't believe this. We actually have some neighborhoods, back where I come from, where it's mostly all blacks there. I know y'all don't have that in Chicago, but we got it down in Texas. Segregation is kind of, especially for the older generation, kind of normative. And you have to be intentional to sort of break that. Because if you just go along with what you've been doing, you'll get what you got. And so there has to be intentionality to it. And then it motivates us to reach out to those in other races. I remember talking with a couple of pastors. At least two times I talked with a pastor who told me that they needed a youth minister, and they were intentionally looking for an African-American youth minister. Because they wanted to be intentional about that. They recognized that there was a void on their leadership staff. They needed that voice, and they happened to need a youth minister trying to reach some of the African-American kids as well as the other kids. And so they said, we're looking for an African-American youth minister. That's intentionality. That's thinking, all right, what do we need in order to reach those of different races? Okay. Next principle is personal skills. This is an underdeveloped area, by the way. We need more to know exactly what the personal skills are of pastors, of leaders of multiracial congregations. But there are a few that came out when we did our research. One is being sensitive to different races. We're going to have to learn to listen to what people of other races, what they want, what they desire. And if we don't, then we're going to miss the boat. So being sensitive to different races. And sometimes we get used to be sensitive to people of our own race. We have certain cultural cues we look for in our own race, but we miss it when we're looking at other racial groups. Patience. Now I know you're saying, well, we need that anyways. The pastors that we interviewed mentioned patience enough that we thought that it may be even more patience is needed in a multiracial congregation. There are going to be people who are going to say things that are incredibly racist at times, unfortunately, and you're going to have to learn how to teach them and guide with them. You yourself are going to have some faux pas. If you start bringing in people of a different race, you're going to say something that they did not intend. That you did not intend to be offensive, but it actually was. There are things that are going to happen that you're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to put out little fires at times. Unfortunately, this is still the case. If you're transitioning a church that's not multiracial into a multiracial church, you're going to have some resistance. You have to be patient with some of those folks. Some of them may leave. And be patient through all that. By the way, just for the record, it's easier to plant a multiracial church than to start and then to transition one. That's one thing we have found out. Because when you plant one, the people are committed going into it. But when you transition one, you got that person been in church for 20 years, and what are you doing to my church? So just for the record, if you're already working in a church, of course, it doesn't do you any good, other than maybe you can send out some of those people into a plant somewhere else. But it's actually easier to plant one with all the difficulties of planting a church than it is to transition one. Empowering other individuals, the leaders that we interviewed talked about how important it was to train other people to work alongside with them. That was incredibly important that they do that. So one of the things that personal skills is, can you train other people? If you're going to transition a church, you really need this because it takes a while to get people on board. I just was meeting with some people from a church where the pastor had the vision 10 years ago, and only recently has the church become multiracial because he worked at empowering individuals, bringing other individuals aboard, getting a solid support team, and then making some of the changes and keep working at it. Relating to those of different races, Michael Emerson in his latest book talks about a sixth American. He says there's 5 racial groups. Well, maybe now there's a 6th one. And the 6th one are people of different races who all have these friendship networks that are more racially diverse, and they're more comfortable being around different races and things of this nature. Well, you're going to need to develop that sort of skill as well. You're going to be a pastor of a multiracial church. You're going to have to learn to be that 6th American. That person can relate to others of different race, can be comfortable. It's a skill you can learn. It may take time, but you can learn to be comfortable being around people of different races. These are personal skills that are very important if we're going to have the leaders of multiracial churches have to develop these skills. Okay, location. We found the vast majority of multiracial churches are located in the inner city or racially diverse areas. Relatively few were located in suburbs. The few that we did find in suburbs tend to be led by African Americans, especially white suburbs. It's difficult to do multiracial ministry in a place where there's not a lot of diversity. Now, sometimes it's pretty obvious. If you're in North Dakota, okay, I get that. But, I'm in Chicago, and we know about Willow Creek, and people drive from Indiana to come to Willow Creek. So it's not about just location. There's more than just location that's important here. And here's what I think is important about it. White flight. You probably heard about it. A phenomenon whereby whites have left decaying in poor neighborhoods to blacks. And with the 2000 census, we know that this is now happening with Hispanics much more than we originally thought. The process reinforces residential segregation and communicates rejection to racial minorities. Churches that go to the suburbs aren't churches that are looking to become multiracial, because that very movement communicates to people of color, you don't want us there. And now you could say, well, I just started this church in the suburb. I didn't fly from anywhere. The people of color they don't know that. So if your church is in the suburb, it's going to be more difficult. Now, here's the good news. I guess kind of good news. What we're seeing is first ring suburbs are becoming racially diverse. People are moving out from the city into these first ring suburbs. So if your church is in the suburb, they're coming to you. Just don't move again. If you're a pastor, then you have the decision: do you move again or do you stay and minister? And some pastors are moving, and thank God some are deciding to stay and minister. I have a friend I developed from a first ring suburb in Dallas who said, help me. I want to minister to the African Americans coming to my neighborhood. And so, so location is important, but as we become more and more diverse, at some point, I think that it'll be very hard to be in a location where you won't be able to attract racial diversity if you make some of these other changes in principles. Okay, the last one is adaptability. And that's the ability of multiracial churches to anticipate the new challenges that are coming their way and or to adapt to the unexpected issues as they come up. I found that the multiracial churches are very flexible. They have to be. You don't know what's going to hit you when you start on this venture. Now, if you're a person that likes everything the same every single day, that is scary. If you're a person that sort of, likes something new, hey, this is going to be fun. So, but adaptability is a very important quality. I can't tell you all the issues you're going to adapt to. You're going to have to develop an attitude of, okay, let's be flexible about this. How can we work this out? I can give you some potential issues that you may have to adapt to. So, let me give you a few to think about. First is language. Especially if your target is Asian and Hispanic Americans, you're going to have to think about issues of language. There are now translator units that you can use for first generation who do not understand English well enough to be comfortable in your congregation. You can think about the signs you have around the church. You can think about ESL classes as a gateway. And one of the things about the first generation is there's a solid argument to be made that the first generation need to go to immigrant churches. And I've never argued that all churches need to be multiracial. But their kids oftentimes don't want to hang around with their parents in their first generation church. So if you can find a way to minister to them, maybe bring in a pastor who can minister to that immigrant group, and then working with that group, minister to the kids, the second generation, a lot of times your church will diversify because of that. But language is something to think about. You should anticipate it. Now, if you're ministering to African Americans, it's not as much of a problem because Ebonics is not a foreign language. If you're any of you from Oakland, California, when all that happened, I have to tell you, Ebonics, it's not a foreign language, all right? Interracial romance. Come on, Dr. Yancey, it's 2007. Who cares about interracial? No one gets hyped up about that anymore. You're wrong. I just did some research where I examined individuals who are seeking to date, single individuals. Hopefully they're single if they're seeking to date. And what I found out was among self-identified Christians, that they're more open to dating someone of a different faith than of a different race. I said, this can't be right. So as a sociologist, I thought, well, anyone can say they're a Christian, You have those people who are they're in the clubs Saturday night, church Sunday morning, they're the ones who are doing it. So what I did was I looked only at Christians who went to church at least once a week, figuring, if you're going to church pretty steadily, that you're at least somewhat serious about your faith. Same thing. Those Christians were more willing to date someone of a different faith than of a different race. Now, what is happening that our youth, our singles, are getting that sort of a message? Another evidence that interracial romance matters, that you better anticipate it being an issue. The whites who are most likely to leave a church that's transitioning from a predominantly white church to a multiracial church, those are whites with kids of dating age. That's what the research has shown. So if you want to sweep under the rug, you're more than welcome to. You're going to pay a cost for that. I think you're much better off honestly confronting some of these fears than just pretending they're not there. Alienation, the numerical minority group. You know, what's interesting is that there's been some research done by Brad Christensen and Michael Emerson and Dr. Edwards, Corey Edwards, that shows that in churches that are multiracial, the group that is the smaller, and by the way, the numerical minority group may be white, may be African American, may be Hispanic. We're not talking about whites and non-whites here. The numerical minority group are less likely to develop friends of people in the church than the numerical majority group. And because of this, they're probably more likely to leave the church, making it more difficult for it to maintain its racial diversity. Another thing to be aware of is that with the numerical minority group, what happens is sometimes those who first join the church, if your church, say, was predominantly white and African Americans start joining the church, those African Americans are more likely to be more comfortable with whites than African Americans as a whole. Culturally, they're more likely to be part of European American culture than African Americans as a whole. If you have whites join a black church, they're culturally more likely to be comfortable with African American culture. Same thing, all right? Well, what happens is your church gets a reputation, hey, people of different races can come here. Now you start getting whites who are not as comfortable with African American culture, or blacks who are not comfortable with white culture, or Asians who are not comfortable with Latino culture. You can make the mistake of thinking, I got this down, once you start getting about 10% of a certain racial group and think, hey, I've learned about these people. They're like us, exactly like us. And then you get some that aren't quite that way. You need to keep on learning. Do not stop learning about these individuals as they start coming in. Do not assume that the ones who came in later are like the ones who came in earlier. You need to think about these numerical minority groups and find ways in which they will not be alienated. And then there's secular, political, and social issues. We are divided in this country along racial lines, but we're divided in this country along political lines as well. And a lot of times multiracial churches don't get as involved in political issues. Some of them do, some of them don't. You need to think ahead about this. My recommendation when people ask me is, by all means, preach about the values, preach about what's right and wrong, preach about things that need to be done, but, you can't take the same sort of shots at political leaders that you might if you have an all-white or an all-black congregation. And, as Emerson and Smith showed, among evangelicals, the political differences are even greater than among all whites and blacks in general. So it's something you better anticipate if your church starts to diversify. Okay, running a little bit low on time, so just real quickly here, a special issue on African Americans, because I like to talk about myself and my people. Actually, I put this up here because it's actually harder to bring African Americans to a multiracial church than other people of other races. And I actually think it's hard for African Americans to head up multiracial churches than other people of other racial groups. We still need some more research on this. I have found that if you're going to reach African Americans, diverse leadership is a must. That there seems to be at a certain point, African Americans will not go to a church that does not have diverse leadership. A few of them will, but you're limited by the percentage that will come to a multiracial church. And I'm talking about laity leadership as well as clergy leadership. If you can't, maybe you're the only pastor of a church, so of course, unless you become biracial overnight, you can't, diversify the clergy. But there's also laity leadership. You can think about training, discipling African Americans to move into leadership. And then what's really important as well is being open to talk about racial issues. You can get away with being a multiracial church and not talk about racial issues if who you're aiming at is whites, Latinas, and Asian Americans. You cannot do that with African Americans. African Americans want to talk about racial issues. And so you have to find some venue for that to happen. Okay. Thank you. God bless you. And now, open for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yancey. Let me prompt our thinking, or at least transition here a little bit before we begin to focus on some of the practical outworkings. Much of this, as you know, was descriptive. That is, principles were derived from what you observe from successful multiracial churches. Though you did not address this, undergirding this, of course, is biblical truth of biblical diversity that is prescriptive. So as we transition, two questions. First, please spell out specifically, just briefly, the biblical truth and principles undergirding this. I think that would be a helpful transition.
Yeah.
It's not just, as you said, the politically correct thing to do.
Yeah.
And second, what is the greater need today, the biblical truth of this issue or the practical outworking of it?
Okay.
The orthodoxy or the orthopraxy,
Okay.
or both?
Okay. When I did my book on Beyond Racial Gridlock, and I sent the manuscript into university, and they sent it out to reviewers, one of the comments was, "Where's the theology?" And I said, "I'm a sociologist. I'm not a theologian. You know. Let's see you theologians do some sociology, and let me get at you." But you know, in all honesty, obviously we have to have some scriptural basis for this. Let me just pull out a couple of scriptures, and I won't develop them that well, obviously, today. But let me point out, you know, the Church of Antioch and how the Church of Antioch was developed. If you read the passage, what you'll find is that the Church of Antioch develops after God has showed Peter all the animals that he was not supposed to kill. And he said, "Go and kill." And Peter says, "No." You know, Peter, of course, thought he was smarter than God. "No, God. I'm not supposed to do that." God said, "I told you you could do that." "No, God." And if you look at that passage, that's telling Peter, look, your culture, you need to go beyond your culture. And it's after that, then, that the Church of Antioch is created. And I think that's an illustration that what happens a lot of times is we get caught up in our own culture. And God was showing Peter, I believe the way the story goes on, that God brought Peter then to, I'm trying to think whether it was a Roman or a Gentile. After that, you may check it with me on the Bible. I don't have it precisely. But God is showing Peter, it's time for you to go out from the Jews. You know, it's not just the Jews that I sent you to. I would also point, as far as a basis for trying to minister to people of different races, the woman at the well story. And I actually have a talk, and in fact, it's the one that I would have done to do tomorrow if I had more time, because it takes a little time to unpack it. But if you really study that John 4 passage, what you really see is that Jesus is intentionally going into this community, the Samaritan, which, by the way, remember, race wasn't the same concept. I mean, the Bible can't talk about race then like we talk about today. The Samaritans were a mixed race group by the way that the Jews saw them. Jesus went into the ghetto and basically did ministry there. And the principles there, I think, really speak well to the sort of ministry that we should seek towards doing. And then finally, I'm trying to, I believe it's in Ephesians. And once again, I have a friend, Mark DeMaz, who's developed this much better than I am. He is a theologian. But and he has a new book coming out where he develops this argument much more. But he argues that, I believe it's Ephesians, that you should look at Ephesians and take Jew and Gentile, instead of Jew and Gentile, say put white and black, because that's what it's really about. That the book of Ephesians, I think that's one about coming together, really is about, because the Jews and Gentiles were just as separate then as whites, blacks, Latinos, so forth are today. So I think the Bible, what I'm saying is, I think the Bible constantly talks about overcoming barriers. The Bible does not talk about overcoming whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, because that wasn't relevant back then. What was relevant was the Jews and Gentiles. If you look at it from that light, then consistently the Bible talks about overcoming these barriers and coming together. I know the historical research on the early church shows that the early church, if we use that as the criteria, was a multiracial church. That, you had Jews and Gentiles, and I can't cite you all the different groups that are there, but I've read some of the concordances that really illustrate that consistently the New Testament, put in the proper context, is about the development of a multiracial church. And so if that's the case, what does that mean here in the United States today? And I would contend what it means in the United States today is that in a society that's as diverse as ours, that more than 8% of our churches should be multiracial. What that percentage should be, I'm not going to say. I don't think the Bible says, yes, about 23.9%, but it should be more than 8% in a society this diverse, because today it's not about Jews and Gentiles, it's about these other groups. And you also ask about, what's more important, the scripture or the practice. That's a new question I really hadn't thought about. Obviously, we have to have a biblical basis for what we do. But once we have a biblical basis, we can't just assume that we can do whatever we want and it'll work out. I mean, God is with us, but God also gives us, our brains. He gives us abilities to learn.
And your principles articulate my personal experience as a Latina working cross-culturally in an evangelical setting. I work for InterVarsity, and for 9 years I worked at Northwestern, applying some of these principles without knowing what they were, but kind of trying to see a multi-ethnic witnessing community on the campus. And we kind of got to a point, let's say with 200 students, where it would be 40% Asian American, 40% white, 10% black, 10% Latino. And I started asking questions. We kind of got there, and then it didn't change any. And then I started kind of looking around at other InterVarsity fellowships and other churches, and even the church that I'm in now, it's a church plant, and it's about the same, 40% Asian American, 40% white, 10% African American, 10% Latino. And the Latinos that are at the church and the African Americans that are at the church are Northwestern grads, Harvard grads, college educated. So as I look at just my own personal experience, not my research, my own personal experience, I keep asking, what is it and what research is there about some of these blended churches? Like, I know the black-white, and I kind of have read some research on the Latino-white and the Asian-white and the black-Latino, but what about Asian, black, Latino? What happens when it gets more complicated? And I just wondered if you could shed some light on that or talk a little bit more about particularly Asian Americans and other minorities.
Right, yeah. A lot of that's probably in that 88% that we don't know about yet, because, if you think about what you're asking for is unique settings, like a black Asian church. Off the top of my head, I cannot think of a multiracial church that's predominantly black Asian. I'm sure it's out there, but I can't think of one that's predominantly black Asian. So I think you're asking very good questions about, and what I can tell you is maybe where we need to go with some of the work. We probably need to go with minority-headed multiracial churches. There's not been a lot of research out there on that, unfortunately. We need to understand what happens when there's no majority group. And I think we do need more research on multiracial churches that are mostly minorities. What I can tell you is that there's a little research on interracial families that are minority. And a lot of times, those interracial families kind of tend to still have the feel, obviously, of being still in the minority. That I think there's something different when you have a white minority than a minority couple. And so I'm wondering if you have a multiracial church that's minority, if the feel is that, we're multiracial, but we're really not part of the mainstream because we don't have a significant percentage of European Americans. I'm speculating right now, to be honest. But you really, more than give you answers, all I can give you is more questions that probably are worth exploring at this point. So I'm sorry that I really don't have a really great answer for you at this point, but that's a fascinating. I will say that one thing I hope to do, this group I'm working with, Mosaics, is eventually develop some arm that includes college students and tries to minister to Christian college students, because I think that's where a lot of the action is at eventually.
Yes, Dr. Yancey, thanks for your presentation. I'm a theologian, and so I need all help I can get from everybody else. Here's my question. Your opposed to strictly racial,
Yeah.
whether it's class,
Mhm.
socioeconomic class, gender, some of these other barriers.
Sure.
Would you argue that the same principles apply, or is there something unique about this racial category that is kind of different?
Very good. Ooh. All right. Am I down? Okay, good. One thing that I would say is I have this argument with some of the people I work with in Mosaics. I always use race and they use ethnicity. Then they tell me that ethnicity is a more accurate term theologically. I tell them that race is a more accurate term sociologically. So when we talk about race and ethnicity, I think we're kind of saying the same thing. Ethnicity can resemble race in a lot of ways. In certain areas of the country, ethnicity is not that important. In other areas, it's very important. So I think ethnicity and race are very quite alike. Class is interesting. Multiracial churches are more likely to have diversity of economic statuses than non-multiracial churches. They're more likely to be multi-class, if you will. And in part of this makes sense because if you think about it, certain racial groups tend to be in certain classes more than other racial groups. So if you attract certain racial groups, you're most likely to attract, say, with some groups more the wealthy or other groups more the underclass. And so I would argue that a lot of the same techniques that churches use to overcome the racial barriers, they also can overcome the class barriers. I'm not sure about this, and that's yet another area, to really study to see how churches deal with these class differences. But I suspect that's the case. Gender is the interesting one. There's no evidence right now that multiracial churches are any more likely to be inclusive on gender than non-multiracial churches. And I don't know what the college's position on women leaders is, so I don't want to step into that landmine too greatly. But I'm just telling you what the sociological research has told me. Now, here's what the interesting thing is. When we looked at multiracial churches and we looked at issues of gender, we found that churches that theologically were more conservative, the multiracial churches that were conservative, were less likely to include women. But when we look at churches that were more progressive in their theology, the multiracial churches that are more progressive theologically were more likely to include women. So it makes for this sort of skewed effect, and what we would call more of a suppressor effect as a variable when we looked at multiracial churches. When we looked at it in the aggregate, it turned out the multiracial churches were about as inclusive as other churches. Then we broke it down by theology, we saw these sort of more skewed effects. I don't know what that tells me, except that I speculate that being multiracial may allow a church more freedom to engage in a certain gender theology. For example, if you're a conservative church and you're inclusive on race, you're less open to the charge of being bigoted, for example. And so you may feel more free to not include women into leadership. On the other hand, if you're a more progressive church and you're inclusive on race, maybe it gives you more legitimacy to go ahead and be more aggressive on gender issues. That's speculation. I can tell you that the skewed effect is there, but I'm speculating as to why it is there. So gender is a different animal than class and than ethnicity. There's nothing right now to this point to suggest that multiracial churches are more inclusive on gender. We'll have to wait and see what happens, in the near future.
Dr. Yancey, again, thank you for your presentation. Two-part question. First, to what degree would you say that a multiracial church, that we should consider a multiracial church a norm within Christendom? Is this something to which all churches should aspire? Second part to the question is that, again, allowing for the vagaries of location where you've got, as you said, North Dakota or something like that, do you have some kind of a tipping point guidelines? At what point should a church start to genuinely consider becoming multiracial?
You mean a tipping point in the community?
Yeah, within the community. Obviously, there are outer ring suburbs like it, or places in Wisconsin or
right.
Inner city Chicago. At what point, from one way or the other, should churches start to consider genuinely transforming themselves into becoming multiracial? Good
questions. I really don't have a tipping point. I guess my personal preference would be that church would look like the city of the community. So if the community was 80% or less of one racial group, the church would look that way. that'd be my preference, but that may not be realistic, but that's how I would personally see it. Your first question was?
Is multiracial, should we consider that to be a new norm?
Oh, a new norm. I think there's still a place for homogeneous churches in special situations. If you mean by a norm that we expect all churches to be multiracial, I'm not prepared to go there. If you're saying by a norm that most churches are multiracial, I think I would like to see that. I think I personally would like to see that. As we get more churches that are more multiracial and the percentages increase, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the dynamic in the church as a whole. At some point, we may begin to now perceive ourselves as, boy, we really have gotten this under control. My personal feeling is we're a long way from that right now. So, I personally would like to see more than half of our churches multiracial. But I think that there's still a purpose for homogeneous churches. And so, at some point, even I would say, maybe we don't need to keep having more and more multiracial churches. But we're so far away from that for me it's not even worth talking about.
Dr. Yancey, thanks for coming in and again sharing your presentation. I guess my question has to deal with, you talked a little bit about suburbia and how the further away you get away from the city, there's less success in multiracial churches. But I'm thinking specifically of the influx of Latino immigrants and how we're seeing that more and more in the outer suburbs and in the small town USA. Are there instances of successful interracial churches that apply these principles or other principles in those type of situations in small town USA where you do see immigrants starting to come in, Latino immigrants or other racial minorities, mostly Latino, coming to those areas?
I think it depends on the area of the country you're talking about. If you're talking about the West Coast, I think you're seeing a lot more of that. And there may well be some churches that are quite successful this way. I've not seen a lot of them up here in the North Central or the Northeast or the South. But in the western part of the United States, you see that a lot more because the residential segregation is different in the West Coast than it is here. You still have residential segregation, but the areas is much smaller, and so within a certain parameter, there's a lot more groups than you would have here. But I do think that what you're pointing out is something worth considering is that maybe the suburban churches, instead of saying, well, there's not many African Americans around, could look towards their Latina neighbors and maybe try to minister to them. And I think that is worth considering. And maybe if churches start doing that, then they will be prepared for ministering to African Americans when the African Americans comes because they've already broken the barriers easily with they've already broken the barriers with the Latinos.
I'm wondering if there's been any discussion, and I'll throw out two hot topics, GINA 6 and illegal immigrants. And I'm interested in terms of how a church striving for multiracial diversity, you mentioned in a sense being careful of political hot topics and particular social issues. Have you seen any workings towards obviously seeking a solid biblical foundation towards what's going on, but working among the different perspectives that you encounter?
As far as the GINA 6 thing, I don't know what churches are working on it right now, whether or not any multiracial churches are working on that particular issue. And I'm not saying multiracial churches cannot get involved in this. I'm just saying that they need to be thoughtful. And I think that what I found is that when churches do get involved, it's usually on an issue like that. What they don't tend to do as much is to take political sides in the big old Republican, Democrat catfight we seem to be having all the time. So they tend to stay away from that, but a specific issue they tend to address. So there may be churches addressing that issue or not. You also mentioned immigration. I don't know any multiracial churches that have been active in that. What I can tell you is that when you look at whites and even blacks who go to multiracial churches, they have more progressive attitudes on immigration than other whites and blacks. The blacks is the interesting thing because on other racial issues, African Americans don't have different attitudes regardless of whether they go to a multiracial church or not. And what I think the thing is that African Americans on other racial issues have thought about those issues. I mean, when it comes to affirmative action or hate crimes or anything like that, they've thought about those issues, but not immigration until they go to a church and now they have Latino brothers and sisters and Asian brothers and sisters, and now they're forced to think about immigration as a racial issue. So I think that multiracial churches are a place in which we can, as Christians, try to work things out and think about what would be a Christian response to immigration, because you're bringing in these multiple perspectives.